not the only factor that affect demand. There are a couple of other factors. For instance, uh, population of a country, that's another factor that affects demand. Then we talked about people, personal preferences, right? So if you like something, right? So if let's say something is becoming more trendy, right? So it's more in fashion, people will buy more of that, right? So that could be a reason that can affect demand. Then the price of complementary goods, price of substitute goods, all of these factors affect demand as well, right? And we talked about all of these in detail. If there's any confusion, I'll be more than happy to answer those questions, right? Okay, now when any of these other factors are changing, we know that it will not be movement along the curve. Instead, it will be a shift in the demand curve, and there will be a parallel shift. So if demand is increasing, your demand curve shifts to the right, like this. If there is a decrease in demand due to any of the factors that we just discussed, there will be a leftward shift in demand curve like this, right? Parallel leftward shift, right? So this is because of other factors. So shift in demand curve is because of other factors, and movement along the curve is due to price. Same is the case with supply. Nothing different, same, right? So what is supply? Supply is the willingness and the ability of a producer to produce a certain product at certain price level during certain time period, assuming other factors are constant. So you will always have price per unit of that good on the y-axis, and you will have quantity supplied on the x-axis, right? In units. Okay, and it will be a usual upward sloping curve like this. Okay, now if we choose any particular point on the supply curve, what it will show us that how much is the price for each unit of the good, and corresponding to that price level, how much quantity is the producer willing to produce, how much quantity a producer is willing to produce. Is this making sense, students? So if let's say this is, I don't know, a dozen apples, right? So if 1 dozen apples is selling for, let's say $10 in the market, then this producer would be willing to produce 100 dozens of that, right? Similarly, if I choose any other point on the supply curve, it will show us a different combination of price and supply, right? So you can see that B is higher than A, so obviously the price will be anything higher than $10, and corresponding to that higher price will be higher quantity supplied. Any confusion so far, students? Okay, now before we move on to market equilibrium, we have to talk about the market supply and the market demand. We have to, right? Class timings are the same, but we will have a slightly longer class today, as we discussed, right? Timings are the same, 9 to 9:45 regular classes, but we couldn't have a class yesterday, so I'll be taking a longer session. Okay, now what is market supply and market demand? So first of all, you have to understand that market is made up of different consumers and producers. Market is made up of different consumers and producers. So when we talk about market demand and market supply, we have to aggregate the demand of all the people consuming that good. I repeat myself, right? So up till now, we have been looking at the demand for a product by one person. If you remember, right, I gave you some examples. So how much is the demand for Coke by Qasim or by any person? That is your individual demand curve, right? So how much is the demand for Coke at different price levels by Qasim? That is what my demand curve will show me, right? Of Coke, right? So this is individual demand curve that shows how much quantity a person is willing to buy at different price level. Is this simple? But am I the only person in the market who buys Coke? Obviously no. Obviously no, right? So market is made up of all the people who are willing to buy Coke, right? Or who buy Coke, right? So think about this. For me, it was showing me, let's say that if the price of each bottle of Coke, I don't know, 50 rupees, right? So if let's say that is for 50 rupees, I consume on average 2 to 3, bottles per week, right? If the price would have been anything lower than 50 rupees, let's say 30 or 35, right? Most probably I'll consume something more, 5 units per week and so on, right? So this is individual demand curve. But this is not what the market demand is, because market is made up of all the consumers who consume a product. Now, how do we extract market demand from individual demand curves? That's what we're about to look at. How to extract, are you getting what I'm trying to say? how to extract why is market demand important. And similarly, after this, we'll look at market supply as well, because prices in the market are based on market forces, not just on how much one person is demanding, or not on the basis of how much one person is supplying. Are you getting me? How to extract a market demand curve from individual demand curve. Market demand curve. Students, are you following me? From individual demand curves. Okay, so that's what we're about to look at. Okay, now think about this. First of all, we'll make an assumption that the market is made up of, let's say, 3 or 4 or 5 consumers. Now, what is the problem with assuming that the market is made up of more consumers? In real life, we know market is made up of hundreds and thousands of consumers, especially for a product like Coke, or especially for a product like this, right? But we can't, show that many individual demand curves on a graph. So we will try to keep it simple. And let's assume there are 3 people in the market, right? There are 3 people in the market who consume, let's say, let's assume a very unique product, right? So let's say there's a special kind of coffee that very few people drink, right? Don't have same purchasing power. Yeah, obviously not everyone has the same purchasing power, but was that a comment? Was that a question? I didn't, Zohan. So think about this, students. Now we are about to look at the process, how we extract the market demand curve from individual demand curve, right? So let's say there are 3 consumers, and I'll show each consumer demand curve with a different color, right? So this is, let's say, for consumer A, this demand curve is for consumer A. Then this is for, let's say, consumer B. Let's say this is for consumer B, right? We can place it a little higher than this one, right? And then there's another one, which is for consumer C, right? Okay, now let's say there are only 3 consumers in the market. Again, I'm saying that this is very unrealistic assumption. Why? Because obviously for any product, there will be hundreds and thousands of consumers. But to kind of keep it simple and easy to understand, so have a look at this, right? Now, what if I choose any random price, right? Let's choose any random price first, right? So let's say this is the price level. At this price level, let's say $5. How much quantity is consumer A demanding for this good, right? Let's say 10 units. At the same price level, how much quantity is this consumer B, which is basically the green demand curve, demanding? Let's say 15 units, right? And then at the same price level, how much quantity is consumer C demanding? That we would know by reading this value, right? So this is 20 units. So at the price of $5 per unit, consumer A, which was the blue demand curve, is demanding 10 units of the good. The consumer B, which is the green line, is demanding 15 units of the good. And consumer C, which is this purple line, is demanding 20 units of the good. Now, if market, for example, is made of only these 3 consumers, what will be the total demand in the market? Students, are you getting what I'm trying to say? So if these are the only 3 consumers in the market at the price of 5, how much will be the total quantity demanded in the market? 45? Do you agree with me? Right? Khadija, Kazan, are you getting me? So the answer is 45. Yes. Why? Because at this price, think about it like this. At this price, consumer A will go to the shop and buy 10 units. Good. Right? At this price, the consumer B will go to the shop and he'll buy 50. And at this price, consumer C will go to the shop and he'll buy 20. So adding these 3 up, assuming that these are the only 3 consumers in the market, right? So that will give you what? The market demand curve, right? Similarly, if you, all you have to do is to, then we can also assume another price level, right? So we can assume another price level. Let's say that is $7. At $7, A demands, let's say, 8 units of the good. At this price of $7, B is demanding, let's say, something less than 15 is, let's say, 14. And at this price level, the C is demanding anything less than 20. So that would be 18. So again, you do the maths. So 8 plus 14, sorry about the writing, it's a little smaller than it should be, right? And 18. So that gives you how much? 22, then 12, 12, and 1, 2, 3, 3, 3, and 2. So that gives you a total of 40. So at this price, what will be the total quantity demand in the market? So at this price, the total quantity demanded in the market will be 40 units. Are you getting me? So when we add up the quantities demanded by individual consumers, when we add up the quantity demanded by individual consumers for different price levels, that gives us what? That gives us market demand curve. How many of you understood what I just said? So if we add up the quantities demanded by individual consumers at different price level, that will give you the market demand curve. So now what is market demand curve showing us? That is showing us not the demand for one individual, but for the entire market at different price levels. My voice is lagging. Students, is my voice lagging? Okay, okay. Is this good now? Okay, perfect. So students, think about this. Did you get this point? Let me write down the definition, right? So what is market demand curve? Market demand curve is sum of individual demand curve. That's the first simple thing that you need to know, right? Market demand curve is made up of all individual demand curves, right? And similarly, market supply curve is made up of all individual supply curves. Or market demand curve is aggregate of individual demand curves, right? So why is that the case? If you need to find the total quantity of any product that the entire market will demand, let's say Coke, then sum up the quantities that individual will, then you need to sum up the quantities that individuals will demand at varying price levels. I forgot this. So this is exactly what we did in the graph that I just showed you, right? That if you are interested, think about this. From Coke point of view, what is important? From Coke point of view, they want to know how much will be the demand? How much do they need to produce in 1 month? How many bottles of Coke? Sorry about that. So Coke company, Coca-Cola needs to know how many bottles of Coke should they produce per month in Pakistan, let's say, right? Now, to find the answer to that question, they need to know how much is the market demand, how much all consumers across Pakistan demand, right, in 1 month. And how can we do that? We can simply do that by adding up the individual demand curves. How do we add up the individual demand curves? Now, to give you a quick idea, right? To give you a quick idea. So is there a lag? I don't know. Other students can tell me, right? Is there a lag, students? Okay, now think about this. So if I was saying you, there are hundreds and thousands of consumers, but how do we gather the data for them? So we add up the quantities of all these consumers at varying price levels. So let's say these different colors, these different demand schedule show how much quantity would different individuals demand at different price levels, right? So as I was telling you, if these are the 3 consumers who buy a certain product, right? So if let's say at the price of $5, how much is the quantity demanded for this consumer A, this consumer B, and this consumer C, right? So for $5, this consumer A is demanding 100. At $7, it would be, we know there's inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. It will be something less. For price even higher than that, it will be even lower, and so on and so forth, right? Right. So similarly for consumer B, at this price, how much is the quantity demanded? Let's say this much. At this price, how much is the quantity demanded? Let's say this much. At this price, how much is the quantity demanded? Let's say this much. And then at this price, how much is the quantity demanded? Let's say this much, right? Yes or no? So after we have, after we know the individual demand curves, finding the market demand is not a problem, because all we have to do is to just aggregate the quantity. All we have to do is to aggregate the quantity at different price levels. Are you getting me, students? Any confusion? Khizr and Khadija, am I making sense? Right? So that is all what you're supposed to do, right? Now, when you look at this, right? So if these are the three consumers in the market, A, B, and C, right? So if I have to find the market demand at the price of $5, how much would be the market demand? All you have to do is to just sum up these numbers, these three numbers, 120, 100, 220, and 220 plus 180. How much? 400. So at the price of $5, there will be total quantity demanded of 400 units. Similarly, at the price of $7, all you have to do is to add these three numbers, right? 80, 90, 120, whatever number you get. So that is how you get the market demand. Any confusion so far, right? Now to write down the definition, graphically, right? Market demand. Now I'm just writing down what I just explained you through the graph. Graphically, market demand is horizontal summation of individual demand which is found by adding up individuals quantity demanded at different price levels. Simple. Any confusion so far? Right? So what can you say? What is market demand curve? Market demand curve is the sum of individual demand curves. That's the first thing you can say. Then if you want to write more explanation on that, what you'll say is that what we actually do is that market demand is horizontal summation of individual demand curves, which is found by adding up individual quantities demanded at different price levels, which I just showed you. Any confusion so far? Students, are we clear on this? Similarly, now moving forward to market supply. Now let me give you an example. If you imagine a product like, let's say, what would be a good example, right? So if you think of a um, basic service like a barber, a barber shop, right? Barber shops, and you know, banking could be one, but when banking like supply, you can do that, but it will be a little difficult to explain, right? So let's take the example of something more obvious and simple to understand, right? So if you think of the market as a city, so let's say we are not taking the example of market as the entire country, but the market is one city, right? So if you think about Islamabad or Karachi or Lahore, any one city, right? Now, how many barber shops there are in total, right? And how many people or customers do they serve per day at the different price levels? I repeat myself. How many barber shops there are? First of all, that's the first thing. If you want to find out the market supply of barber services, right, you need to know how many barber shops are there in a city, right? And how much and what are their supply curves? What are their supply curves? Let's say this is one firm, this is another firm. Then if you are a little confused, I can also take non-parallel lines. It doesn't make any difference, by the way, right? It doesn't make any difference, right? And then another one like this. So that, let's say it was like this. And then you have another one like this, right? And so on. Okay. Now let's say these are the three shops only. Again, as I said, the problem is not that we can't add up the values. The problem is only that we can't show it on the graph, right? So that's why I'm always assuming that there are only three firms, right? So there are three firms in the market, three barber shops in any neighborhood, any vicinity in a city or whatever, right? Now, if from these three shops, I have to find out the market supply, right? So on the y-axis, we have price per cut, how much price do they charge for each haircut, right? And how many customers, number of customers do they, entertain in one day, number of customers, right? Now, all we have to do, just like we were doing it for the demand, you have to know, you have to know that, let's say at this price level, right? If let's say 150 rupees per haircut, this shop A is catering to per day 50 customers, right? Then this person at this price level, at the same price level, right? The shop B will be catering to, let's say 70. Just give me a second. Would you give me a second? Okay, now think about this. So students, are you getting this right? So at this price level, this price per haircut, right? If that's the example that we are taking, right? So shop A is catering to how many customers? 50. How many customers is shop B catering to? 70. And how many customers is shop C catering to? Let's say 90. So at this price level, the total supply of haircut services in the market would be sum of these three values. As simple as that. So 90 plus 70 is 160, 160 plus 50 is 210. So the total number of customers that will be entertained per day at this price level will be 150. Sorry, 210, whatever the amount is, right? Easy. Any confusion so far? We good on this, students? Right? Exactly. So that is what you need to know. Similarly, how are we getting the other values? So other values are also calculated in the same way, right? So if I choose any price higher than this, let's say 200 rupees per haircut, right? So for 200 rupees per haircut, right? Shop is, let's say, handling 60 customers, right? So if this is 200 rupees per haircut, right? And shop B is, let's say, entertaining how many customers, right? So somewhere in the middle. So let's say this is 80 or 75, whatever, right? So let's say 75, and then shop C is catering to how many customers, right? So let's say 110, right? So at this price level, then how much will be the total number of people entertained in the market? How much is the total supply? So you can find it yourself just by adding the three numbers that I mentioned over here. So 60, 75, and 110, right? So that's your answer. Easy, 245. Any confusion, right? So technically, by the way, Zohan, this is part of AS economics, but I taught you this in your IGCSE, but technically you're supposed to know this in your AS level. It's not part of the IGCSE, but yeah, it was good to know that. It helped. I'm sure this would have helped you in your exam. Okay, are we good on this, Khizr? Khatija, any confusion, anything that's not clear? Now, if all of this is clear, then now we are coming to the very final main thing that I think we all have been waiting for quite some time. Very nice. Thank you so much. Okay, now think about this. So the very first question I asked you when we started off with this unit 2, that how are prices determined? How are prices determined? So that was the big fundamental question that we were answering. How are prices determined? So who gets to decide? Like this could be a very interesting question. How are prices determined? So who gets to decide that an average or a typical haircut in Pakistan or in any particular city of Pakistan will cost, let's say, 200 rupees, 300 rupees, 500 rupees, 1000 rupees, whatever, right? So the answer to that is the demand and the supply. So it's basically the demand and the supply of a good, right, that determine the price, equilibrium price. Now we are moving to, very nice, that's very nice. Okay, now we are moving to the final question, that how are prices determined? And I just told you that prices are determined on the basis of market forces and market supply. Market forces and, market force of demand and supply, right? So we need to know how much is the demand of haircut services in a certain market and how much is the supply in that market. So supply curve always upward sloping, demand curve always downward sloping. Where the two curves intersect, that is market equilibrium. Now we are not looking at the individual supply. We are looking at, nor we are looking at the individual demand. We are talking about the entire market. And do remember that for the market, it is the total demand, which is basically market demand, and the total supply, which is your market supply. And where the two curves intersect, that is the market equilibrium, right? Now, this might be a new term for you, but market equilibrium is where the market demand is equals to market supply. Any confusion, right? So this would show you where the two curves are intersecting. This is the equilibrium point. Let's label it as E1. So let's say a typical haircut in Pakistan or in one particular city of Pakistan would, let's say, cost 250 rupees per haircut, and the total number of customers who will be entertained, right, per day, per week, whatever is, let's say 5,000, right? So this on the y-axis is showing you the equilibrium price. What do we call this? This is known as equilibrium price, right? Because this is where the demand and supply are equal. So where the demand and supply are equal, the point of intersection, we call it equilibrium point. We sometimes label it as E1, and this is known as equilibrium price on the y-axis, right? And on the x-axis, the quantity that we have is known as equilibrium quantity. Any confusion so far? I mean, like, don't worry, right? And on the x-axis, we have the equilibrium quantity. Any confusion? Anything that any one of you did not understand? Equilibrium quantity. So what is equilibrium price showing you? It shows you how much will be the price of a typical unit of the good, right? Per unit of the good, and how much will be the equilibrium quantity, like how many people, in this case, since we're talking about haircut services, barber services, so we would know that how many people are entertained per day, how many people get either haircut per day or could be per week or per month, whatever, depending upon how we have collected the data. Easy? Any confusion so far? Anything that's not clear? Now, this is what we have been waiting for, that how our prices of the goods determined, but the story hasn't completed yet. Market forces are constantly changing. Now, I'll give you some examples and you have to tell me that what will happen as the result, right? Now, I'm just raising this because now you know the terminology. Now, let's say that what has happened, right? So let's say shaving machines have become cheaper. Now, first of all, you have to think about it, and I would appreciate if you can send me private messages, like as the answer to this. If shaving machines or trimmers or whatever you want to call it, I don't know, have become cheaper, how would that affect this market? Who can tell me? How will lower prices of shaving machines affect this market? First, tell me what effect would you expect? And then after you've told me, I'll tell you how to analyze that. So first of all, tell me, if shaving machines, shaving trimmers, whatever you want to call it, right, have become cheaper, how will that be shown on this curve, on this graph, right? Is there more demand for what? Demand will increase, supply will decrease. Okay. Okay. Right. I'm waiting for your response. Okay, Zuhan. Okay, we'll see in a bit. But just tell me, Zuhan, in terms of the shift. Khatija, I'm waiting for your response as well. So what do you think? If shaving, right, okay, yes, Zuhan, right. So if shaving machines, trimmers have become cheaper, how will that be shown on this graph? Right, okay, yeah, that's correct, Zuhan. So think about this. It's no rocket science. It's not a complicated thing. Just let's break it through. Now, if shaving machines are easier, right, like cheaper, right? Why do you need a shaving machine, right? So that you can shave on your own. If you want to, cut your hair on your own, by the way, that would be a very difficult thing to do. I don't know much people who have done something of the sort. But let's assume those machines are good enough that you can even cut your own hair, right? If that happens, lesser people are expected to go to the barber shops to get the haircut done, right? With that happening, don't you think that the demand will decrease? Don't you think that the demand for these services will decrease? Am I making sense or not? Am I making sense here? right? So the demand for haircut services will decrease, which means your demand curve will shift to the left like this. Now, when your demand curve is shifted to the left, right, everything else is constant. Now think about this. The only change that has taken place in the market is that shaving machines have become cheaper, right? So people can do their own haircuts, or perhaps if you have a friend or whoever, a sibling, right, they can give you a haircut with that machine. Now with that happening, lesser people are going to the barber shops, and so your demand curve shifts to the left. But why hasn't the supply shifted? Why hasn't the supply curve shifted? Because there are same number of barber shops in the market at the moment. The same number of barber shops in the market at the moment. So the new equilibrium will be where the new where the new demand curve, which is this orange line, intersects with the original supply curve, which is this purple line. So this is your new equilibrium. So at the new equilibrium, which I'll label as E2, shows you the new equilibrium price, which is lower than the previous equilibrium price. So let's assume that is 200 rupees per haircut. And your equilibrium quantity is also lower since lesser people are availing these services now. Any confusion so far? Right, obviously, yeah. So it was a little, yeah, but you did get my point that we were assuming that the demand will decrease. Why hasn't supply shifted? Because think about this. For now, there is no change in the quantity of barbershops. There's no change in the quantity of barbershops. So supply curve did not shift. However, if you notice over here, from this point on the supply curve, you have moved to this point on the supply curve. And what do we call this? So when you move from a point higher on the supply curve, when you move from a point higher on the supply curve, which was previously labeled as E1, to a point lower on the supply curve, what is that called? We did use a term for that. Do you remember? What was that called? From E1 to E2, that is contraction in supply. So the demand curve has shifted. So there is lower demand for these services. And as a result, there has been contraction in supply, given the fact that now hair cutting services pay you less. So that has resulted in contraction in supply. Now producers are not ready to produce that much quantity, right? They're not ready to provide that much quantity. So think about this. Previously at 250, the quantity that they were providing was 5,000 haircuts during a certain day or whatever, right? Now with price being reduced to 200 rupees per haircut, now the quantity that producers are providing is only 4,000. Any confusion so far? Right? So you move left on the x-axis and you have moved down on the y-axis. You have moved down on the y-axis and left on the x-axis. Confusion? Anything not clear? Right? We good? Can you move on? Right. Okay. Now I'll give you another example. So let's zoom in at the market, right? So we'll do a couple of examples before, we are absolutely clear, and then we'll start the new topic. Okay. Now let's assume this is the market for pizza, right? So let's say this is the market for pizza, right? So you have price per pizza on the y-axis, you have quantity on the x-axis, quantity of pizzas on the x-axis, right? And the market supply will obviously be based on all the restaurants that produce pizza, right? So market supply in the pizza market will comprise of all the firms, right? So Pizza Hut, and then you have what else? I don't know, Cheesiest, I don't know. There are so many other brands. What other restaurants produce pizza, right? Right? Okay, you got the idea. So market supply is made up of all restaurants that produce pizza, right? Which includes Pizza Hut. I mean, just look at me. I only know the name of one company, right? So this market supply is made up of all the firms, all the restaurants that produce pizza, and downward sloping market demand is made up of all consumers who consume pizza, right? Easy, simple. Okay. Now, where the market supply and market demand intersect, that will be your equilibrium point. That will show you how much will be the price of each pizza, right? Let's say 2,000 rupees, right? And how much how much quantity of this good is being sold during certain day or certain week. Let's say per day, we are looking at per day, right? So in Pakistan, let's say 5 lakh, right? Pakistan is a big country, right? So 5 lakh people consume pizza on daily basis in Pakistan at an average price of 2,000 rupees. Easy. Is this making sense? Right? Students, are you getting me? Okay. Now, this was one thing. This is where the equilibrium is at the moment. Now, let's assume that, you know, the bread, I don't know if that's called bread or whatever, right? The dough of the bread, the dough of the pizza, the bread that is used to make the dough of the pizza has become expensive. Now, what's the change that is taking place, students? Listen to this carefully. The bread that is used to make the dough of pizza has become expensive. The price of that has gone up. How will we show that change on this graph? How will we show that change on this graph? That's the question. Okay, so less than 1 minute left. I'm